Okay, so the biggest news story of the week from our perspective is various bits of news emerging from Bethesda Game Studios. Obviously, recently Fallout debuted on Amazon Prime, new TV show, 8 episodes. Watched them all. I think it's absolutely terrific. It's a huge amount of interest in Fallout at the moment. Obviously, we've just had the Fallout Next Generation patch, but Bethesda continues on regardless. There's been reports that in the wake of Fallout, BGS is looking to increase its output. But I think the focus in the short term is going to be more on Starfield, a beta patch for PC launch this week. And there was various announcements concerning what's happening on Xbox, which is to say that the long-awaited performance modes are being added. Oliver, do you want to kick off the discussion on this? Because I think based on the disclosures from Bethesda, this is going to be a performance mode that's quite different from what we've seen elsewhere.
Yeah, so what it seems like is they're basically allowing you to uncouple the frame rate target from your settings. That's what it appears to be. So they're basically saying you can set 30, 40, 60, or potentially an uncapped frame rate in terms of your actual target, in terms of what you're trying to VSync to. And then you get a toggle for visuals and performance on Series X consoles. So you actually get to choose those independent of each other, which could be, I think, very interesting for our testing. I think that it's worth tempering expectations because they are talking a lot about VRR there. And also we know from testing the Frankenstein PC, Rich, that the game would have trouble probably running at a consistent 60 FPS in any visual mode that Bethesda chooses to throw at us just because of its CPU limitations, I think, in towns, even in a hypothetical performance mode. So I think that's probably the key question here. And I think my read on this is probably that it's going to be a mode that works best. These modes work best with VR displays potentially, and that people should keep their expectations in line for a mode that might not actually be able to hit that full 60 FPS refresh at all times.
Yeah, I agree. I was just looking actually at the notes that Bethesda has released, and I'll quote here. We've heard from many that you'd like to have more control over the graphical fidelity and performance on Xbox, similar to how PC players can customize their experience. We're now enabling that on Xbox Series X with a few options that you can use to find the best fits for your playstyle and display. For each of these, we highly recommend a variable refresh rate display running at 120 Hz, and to verify your Xbox is set up to use it. If you have it set up this way, Starfield will now default to a frame rate target of 40 while keeping the priority for full visuals. And they're saying that there's choices between 30, 40 and 60 frames per second. And there's also talk of an uncapped frame rate on VRR displays. If you don't have VRR or running 120, you can still select from 30 and 60. Screen tearing may occur at times when selecting 60 on a non-VRR display. And then so basically, you've got a toggle between the various frame rate targets that are set, but they seem to be suggesting a default of 40 if you've got 120 Hertz VRR. Prioritize. You can prioritize between visuals and performance while trying to maintain the frame rate target. So if you're looking to target 60, they recommend changing to performance. But it's interesting because there's nothing stopping you staying on the visuals mode with a 60 target. Prioritizing visuals keeps the highest resolution while maintaining full detail for special effects, lighting, and crowds. Prioritizing performance lowers internal resolution and detail for special effects, lighting, and crowds. Both modes may adjust internal resolution dynamically when scenes or action get heavier as well. When switching between modes, you'll see the light change briefly as the system catches up with the new mode, which sounds a bit odd.
Yeah,
maybe some sort of accumulation on the global illumination going on there.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah. If they change the GI setting.
I think this is quite interesting because you can select your frame rate target and you can select the quality level. Now, typically, of course, in a console game, these modes, the lower the higher the frame rate, rather, the lower the resolution. But this is basically giving you the choice, but also giving some wiggle room with dynamic resolution scaling, seemingly, which is quite interesting. But it is different, and I think based on what Oliver was saying, absolutely, when they're talking about highly recommending VRR, that means that it's not going to be locked 60, because why recommend VRR if it is? It would just run at 60, right? And yeah, if we go back to the testing we did way back on that DF Direct special in the wake of Starfield's launch, where we basically ran the actual Xbox CPU with a GPU that's very console-like, very PS5-like, you could see that we were CPU limited in those cities. Now, CPU utilization has improved significantly since launch, but you're not suddenly going to gain an extra 50% of performance to lock you at 60 in those cities. But with that said, the game has so many different settings, so many different content scenarios, that absolutely I can fully imagine that a ton of it will run at 60, as it did in that testing back there. Mm-hmm. So very, very interesting, I think. Alex, any thoughts?
Parsing through all the information from that Bethesda posting, the one thing I was curious about is why they wouldn't offer a 4K 120 hertz with no VRR 40 hertz mode. Because that's a potential use case for people who don't have VRR but have 120 hertz. I'm not sure how often that set exists, but as things like VRR, I think with some sets, like they require like certain, for example, like quality modes on the set, so you won't get some of like the post processing maybe you want, or there's just, I would think I would like it I like that they are emphasizing that it is probably best with VRR, but I don't think it should be a whole requirement on just a pure technical level for the modes to exist in the first place.
They will run without it. I think it's just the screen tearing thing that concerns me a bit. I guess we'll have to see how that all manifests.
I mean,
in the final patch.
Yeah, screen tearing is interesting. Like for me, I never run screen tearing on PC, and I think like for a console game, I don't know, it depends. Like we've seen it like both used well enough in some moments, but even like the Call of Duty games have gotten, I would say, kind of bad at it. Like that's where like I always thought they did it like the best, where like it only tears on the top portion of the screen, otherwise they hold the frame so that you get a normal frame drop, so that you don't just get like a full tear line in the middle of this frame. But at the same time, like most recent Call of Duty titles, especially on like older gen consoles, they do it, they tear pretty often and drop frames pretty often. So like it depends really on the performance profile of the game about like how and what type of tearing they're doing. But usually, I don't know, I'm kind of against tearing in general. I'd prefer a VSync drop, usually, as weird as that sounds, because I don't like VSync. I think it's just a little bit more forward compatible, and it's a little bit more broadly compatible with all the displays you have out there.
Especially when you're thinking about the areas in which this game probably would be dropping frames on a Series X. It's going to be in those cities where input response is less important. And I think the clarity of the image, the coherence of the image, is a little bit more important. So for sure, like if the game was dropping frames in like busy battle encounters very frequently, I would, maybe that's an area where screen tearing could be helpful. But in these like cities, it just, it's not really necessary, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, basically, if you've got 120 hertz HDMI 2.1 display, and you're good to go. I think variable refresh rate, I mean, they're specifically saying this is where it runs best, and Xbox has got an excellent VRR implementation at 120 hertz, so I can well imagine that it will actually iron out a lot of the performance problems that you would probably see on a non-VRR display. But I'm just really curious to see how this all checks out, because this concept of giving choice to the user on the console, it's a bit of a double-edged blade. It's something that you would love to see, right? But at the same time, most people don't really adjust the settings or understand what the settings are doing, or are unable to pass what they're actually seeing in a correct way. So yeah, I can well see why there are sort of guardrails. In actual fact, it does suggest that there are some guardrails here where it looks as though they're recommending pairing particular frame rates with particular settings. So I guess that maybe goes halfway there. But yeah, I mean, this is all looking pretty good, I think, and I'm really looking forward to testing it. I mean, the whole 30 FPS controversy around Starfield before launch was a bit of a nothing burger, I think, to a certain extent, because, the nature of the game is that it's so variable that, you kind of needed a common frame rate to make it consistent, and 30 was just the best choice at the time. Even so, let's talk about some supporter questions that we've got here. Let's have a quick look. This one from Ty Jesus.
I like that.
Hey DF team, exclamation point, just saw the new performance options for Starfield and I love the flexibility. While most console games will forever make players decide between quality and performance, the Starfield approach allows players to get better performance today by lowering settings while also allowing the game to live up to its full potential. High visual settings plus high frame rates on inevitably more powerful future consoles. Could this be part of what is meant by making games quote unquote forward compatible? Interesting point. Because that could actually open the door to, just 4K 60 running perfectly fine on the visual settings on future Xboxes kind of makes sense. Hi DF team, exclamation point. In a recent interview, Todd Howard stated Bethesda's trying to quote unquote increase our output with regards Elder Scrolls and Fallout. Why hasn't this been done already? Surely it would have behooved, it's a lovely word, surely it would have behooved Microsoft to have given them a dump truck of money so they could have been developing these games alongside Starfield. Is it simply not possible these days for a studio to be developing multiple AAA games in parallel? We'll tackle that one in a minute. Where do you stand on this one's from Snorlax Jobless? Where do you stand on Starfield performance mode? Do you think it will be a 50 to 60 experience or will it drop a lot? Where does that leave the PS5 Pro version? Wow, sort of jumping the gun a bit there. This one from Gluten-Free Potato Glutton. Now that Bethesda has officially announced 40 and 60 FPS patch for Starfield on Series X, can we stop making excuses for games that don't ship with a performance mode, primarily Xbox games, and blaming everything on the console CPU? Poor Zen 2 has erroneously been used as a scapegoat and deserves an apology! Exclamation point. It's now apparent that the likely reason for no 60 FPS mode on release was because of Series S and related Microsoft policies. Let's call it how we see it, gentlemen. Oliver, let's tackle that last one first.
Yeah, that's not really the case, because if the game is CPU limited, it's going to be similarly CPU limited on a Series S versus a Series X. It's not likely to be different there. Though, actually, there is some interesting element to this where Bethesda apparently isn't going to be shipping these modes on Series S. And that's like a little bit weird. A little bit of a shame, because I think there's image quality room to improve the frame rate there. I think there is. It ran at 900p internally, FSR2 to 1440p. I thought it looked really, really good for a Series S version of the game. You could imagine like a 1080p performance mode maybe in that case. But in that case, I don't think it's actually the GPU that's holding them back from doing that. I think it's just probably a perception that the image quality might not be good enough, or that the console's not being used with enough VR or 120 hertz displays to justify doing those bespoke visual modes, although I would disagree in that case, but right. That's their emphasis.
Alex, anything to add?
I also, I just want to counteract the sentiment in the last question, then we can go on to the other ones, because I do think, like I've said it before, like Zen 1 was not a good gaming CPU. Zen 2 is the first time like it got like competent enough to be like the competition that could drive Intel and drive AMD against each other. And it's like when you get to Zen 3, it's like that 5000 series. It's like, ooh, now we're cooking. And then I really think like the newest Ryzens are like really good CPUs. I think they're just incredibly good. I really would recommend them to like almost anyone. The platform is so good too. And I think like for the time period when they came out with, that's what AMD had. But like, if you look at there's the benches you can do on PC. If you look at Zen 2 versus, Ryzen 7 7800X3D or 14900K, my gosh, you'll see that there is a large divide, and there's also a frame time health divide between these CPUs too. So like, I don't want to say like that this shows that these Zen 2 CPUs are like godlike or something like that, and it's all poor developers who don't know how to use them well. Well, I'm going to say there's like always realistic limitations for any bit of hardware, especially in comparison to other ones. And yes, they do limit the ambition of games to a certain degree, and they limit design decisions, or they limit, like frame rate decisions. And this is a classic example where they are putting limitations on it. They're saying like, play this with VRR. Why would they say that?
Yeah.
They're the game developers, so.
I also just think this game is not struggling on the consoles. It's running at 30 FPS, but it's a very consistent 30 FPS to the extent that's their visual target. They've achieved it, and they've achieved it well, compared to something like Baldur's Gate 3, which runs sub 30, certainly sub 60 on the consoles. In this case, it's not necessarily a situation where the CPU is underperforming relative to what the game is trying to do. It's just that somewhere along the line they decided, hey, 30 FPS is our target, so we're going to design everything to that. I think it's a little bit of a different situation in my view.
Yeah, I agree.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, yeah, absolutely. It's not going to be a lock 60, otherwise they wouldn't be talking up VRR. It would be irrelevant in that case. But I do think, based on our prior tests, there's going to be a lot of content in that game that will run at 60, maybe even on the visuals mode. I think that's what's kind of cool about it, is that you will be able to choose, and there will be, as Ty Jesus says, forward compatibility options there, in that you can just run everything maxed, which sounds good to me. I was quite intrigued by this concept of where does this leave the PS5 Pro version, assuming that there's going to be a PS5 version to begin with, which may happen next year. I mean, ultimately, if there's no Pro implementation specifically, and I can see that would be tricky for Microsoft on a couple of counts. First of all, when are they actually going to get development kits? They're competitors after all. And secondly, will they even support it at all? And if they don't, then the Ultra Boost mode will kick in, and I dare say you'd be able to get the visuals mode running at 60, but that is obviously highly speculative. And even the concept of a PS5 version of Starfield is speculative at this point. Oliver, what do you make of this thing about, upping output from BGS, and why hasn't Microsoft just given them a fat pile of cash to get on with it?
Well, they have a limitation in terms of their overall studio size, what they're equipped to accomplish, right? They work on one project at a time. Famously, they're working on Starfield, and now they're working on the next Elder Scrolls, and they're very open about that. They were working on Fallout before that, then Skyrim, then Fallout, then Oblivion, so they're a one game studio, and that's what they're set up to accomplish. If they were a multi-team studio, they could accomplish a parallel development on a Fallout title. In this case, it sounds like maybe they're talking about doing getting another studio involved, sort of like what was done with New Vegas. Maybe using the creation engine still, just trying to get a game out there a little bit quicker. I think it's a good idea. I think that Microsoft should have probably been organized to achieve that some years ago, maybe not just right now, but I think it's a good idea for sure.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it is, taking on one of these games, it's a huge undertaking. And I dare say that they are working on multiple games simultaneously. It's just when you are talking about games of this size, the work doesn't just happen by throwing more people at it, There's only sort of a limited amount you can do. You've obviously got to have people that know the franchises, that can actually work on these things, that can produce results. It's not that easy. Otherwise, you'd have seen the likes of Naughty Dog parallelize themselves, producing games every year. It just never happened. It's just not really viable. But it is good news, I guess, that they are looking to increase their output, because these games are great, and obviously we'd like to see more of them, as opposed to one or two per generation. Just trying to look at these other questions, but everything looks to have been covered. Mm-hmm. I'm really looking forward to testing this out. It's kind of going to be a performance mode that's quite unlike anything we've seen elsewhere. I'm curious how it's going to pan out on the various types of content in the game. But, Bethesda seem to be trying to cover all of the bases here. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what they come up with.
Yeah.
And with that...
Oh, one little thing I just want to say.
Oh, go on, Alex.
I hope this is a new initiative from Microsoft to and this is an exemplary title for it. And maybe Fallout 4's next gen update will fall into that after a certain level of patching occurs. But I want to see them have more standardized modes on Xbox consoles like this. Just because I think, especially the forward compatibility part, if they are going to be pushing next gen to be a lot more powerful, having an unlocked VRR 4K 120 mode for like premier games of the last gen. Like, what if they're like, just, you can play Starfield at 4K 120 on that Xbox, like that'd be great.
I would also just throw in as a final note that to the extent that they are allowing you to uncouple the performance and the image quality targets, you do want to, I do kind of I'm an advocate of certain constraints on things, because you don't really want to run the performance mode at 30 FPS, and you don't want to give people a bad experience, right, in these games.
Right, yeah.
So
they might erroneously set it up that way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There's a very good argument. I think there's a very good argument that I could make right now to say, hey, lock these down, do 2 or 3 discrete modes. So at the same time, like, obviously I'm a big fan of the flexibility, and for Digital Foundry, it makes for a very exciting game. But I do think that there should be at least a configuration by default, something that's easy to understand, that players can wrap their heads around and have a good experience. I think that's very important as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, they've got a massive paragraph on those notes on how these modes work. So yeah, that's typically never going to be read. So it needs to be simple.